Hello, my name is Brett Champion, and today I'll be talking about what's new in visualization in the Wolfram language, including uncertainty visualizations and multi-panel outputs and other improvements over the past version or so. Good morning. My name is Brett Champion. I'm the manager of the visualization team here at Wolfram. And today I'm going to be talking about what's new in terms of visualization functionality in the system. Before I get into my content, I'm going to advertise the talks of several of the other members on my team. So later this afternoon, Emmanuel Garces is going to be speaking about geovisualization, what's new or what's forthcoming in 12, what's new in some of the recent versions. Tomorrow at 12:30, Nirmal Malapaka is going to be discussing complex valued visualization, which is pretty much an entirely new set of functions coming in version 12. And then tomorrow afternoon at 2:30, Min is going to be discussing recent advances in labeling and automated labeling in the Wolfram language and in the visualization functions. My talk is everything else. So let's see. Jumping right in. A lot of what we do is iterative, and so we introduce an option and then it rolls out over a sequence of versions to the 100+ visualization functions where it may make sense. One of those is scaling functions. In 11.3, we added support for scaling functions and list point plot 3D. I'm not going to show an example of that. Coming in 12, we're adding it to the discrete plots, partially to support the documentation effort of some work that the symbolics teams have been working on. And so here we have a discrete plot of Stirling S1, which grows just incredibly quickly. I mean, actually, this is absolute value of Stirling S1 because it alternates in sign, and I just wanted to show the growth in magnitude. And so now with the scaling functions, we can do this on a log scale, and you can see on the log scale, it goes from 1 up to 10 to the 50th by the time you're at one of the parameters equals 50. Just insane growth on this thing. We also have it for 3D, so here's Stirling S1 again, plotted over both of its parameters. And again, you can see along that space, it's going up to 10 to the 50, 10 to the 60 very quickly. So the next feature I want to talk about is some improvements we've made to plot markers and to mesh, especially with regard to like plot and list plot and a lot of the curve generators. So this is actually a version 11.3 result. If you change the curve colors, it's a version 6 result, where the mesh always used the same color no matter how many curves you have. And so I have 4 curves, and they're red, blue, green, and yellow. But all the mesh points are blue. So coming in 12, the mesh points will follow the plot style by default, which should make a bunch of people happy. I know this came up frequently on Stack Exchange and Community and this sort of thing. We also fixed some bugs along the way that had dozens of reporters. But I'm not showing an example of those because I'm not going to show off bugs. We also in the process of overhauling that aspect of plot markers, have updated the plot markers in general. So there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of how to specify what the shapes are, how to specify what the size of the shapes are. And if I look at the automatic markers, then if I select one of these, and if I select it well, then this is actually now a graphical element rather than being a string, a character in a string, which should give us better, slightly better positioning, slightly better sizing. Shouldn't make the graphics too much bigger. And I'm looking forward to better positioning. Let's see. Still on the topic of markers. So in version 11.3, I believe, we added vector markers as an option to vector plot and stream markers as an option to stream plot, endless stream plot, endless vector plot, and all their other cousins. So by default, you do a vector plot and you get a bunch of fairly generic looking arrows. And vector markers and stream markers allows you to control, in I think a very nice way, what those arrows look like, what the shape of the arrows are, and how they're positioned. So we have a lot of named marker shapes. And so we have Dart being used on this vector plot, and it's sort of a fancier arrow. Dart actually goes back, Dart and Drop, which is being used for the stream plot, actually both go back to version 7, but it was this weird syntax using vector style goes to this string, and if you wanted that shape and it to be red, then there was further magic incantations that I always had to go back and check emails to see what they were. So we factored the shape out and made sure that it combines well with vector style and plot style and these sorts of things so that it's easy to document, easy to predict what you're going to get. This probably isn't going to show up well on the screen, but these have auto-completions, and similar to plot themes, the auto-completions have little iconic versions of what they look like, so you don't have to say, well, what is pointer again? You can look and see that pointer is an arrowy, triangle sort of thing. And so thank you to the front-end team for allowing us to do that in the auto-completions. And now up there. Let's go back to Dart. And so the other thing I mentioned is that we have control over what the arrows look like. And in the case of vectors, of the vector plots, we have control over how they're placed. And we're using placed for this. And so we have, at the moment, 3 named positions for technical reasons. It's not arbitrary, although I don't know that arbitrary is necessarily that useful, although I'm sure there are cases for it. But the most important ones are being able to say that my arrow is going to start at the point, my arrow is going to end at the point, or the default is that the arrow is centered on the point. And these 3 plots show you why having them centered is our default setting, even though everybody sort of naively expects it to be this case, that I have arrows coming out of my points, and in fact we center the arrow on the point. And the reason is that if you look at this one where you have sort of this circular field, it's all sort of tilted. It feels tilted a little bit. And then the other, the one on the far right is sort of tilted the other way. And so by centering the vector, you sort of cancel out these visual effects and visual biases. So now into so the really cool new stuff. So we are supporting natively within the visualization functions, at least some of the visualization functions, support for uncertainty using around, which, Jose, are you giving a talk about around? Nope. Okay, so you get to come to me. So around is basically what we came up with when we reluctantly decided that we couldn't use plus minus. And so we have a value, and then we have some uncertainty associated with that value. And I'll just copy one of those out. That was weird. Okay. And if we look at around, it typesets as a plus minus sort of looking thing. And so we're supporting around in list plot, date list plot, bar chart, a lot of the close cousins of those, so list log plot and date list log plot and that sort of thing. In future versions, we'll roll it out to more and more of the visualization functions. So plot and probably the 3D things and anywhere that it sort of makes sense. Amusingly, things like pie charts support around. They don't do anything with it. They just look at the first argument, the main value. At least for now, at some point, maybe there will be some weird representation of uncertainty in pie charts, but I've yet to see an instance of those that looks good and can be easily interpreted. But anyway, so the left plot, we have just a bunch of y values and uncertainty associated with them. In the right plot, we have uncertainty associated with the x and the y values. And so we get the error bars in both directions. We aren't limiting ourselves to around. We're taking the opportunity to also support uncertainty using interval in all of these functions. How it looks visually is a little bit different. So interval is just a line showing the extent, whereas with around we have the caps at the top and the bottom. And so we have controls for that. So we have two new options, interval markers and interval markers style. So we can say that we want bands or we want the bars or whatever representation sort of makes the most sense for your data and your application. And then the interval marker style, I don't know that I've had to say that a lot out loud, allows us to control the normal parameters of how the markers are drawn, so thickness and color, and if I wanted to make them dotted for some reason, I could. By default, they're going to inherit from the plot style, but you have sort of full control and probably even more control in future versions. So here's an example using actual data that Jeff Bryant put into alpha for us so that we could query for it. I'm not actually showing the query. It's all hidden in this iconized output. But it is giving us the, and I forgot to change the text size for the labels. So we have a bunch of, these are all identified exoplanets. And the horizontal axis is the estimated mass of the planet, and the vertical axis is the radius in meters. And so this is a log linear or list log linear plot, so we have a log scale along on the x-axis and a linear scale on the y-axis. And then we're styling the points and styling the uncertainties, and some of those uncertainties are quite large, and this is the nice set of planets. Yes?
Why doesn't it rescale the labels automatically since the tick marks are scaling?
Because I manually scaled the tick marks. I changed the style. I edited the style sheet to have. Right. There's nothing in the syntax, although and you may have noticed, although a lot of times it's really small, that I'm eliding a lot of options. And so, right. So like up here, there are options hidden behind this ... that aren't, immediately relevant to. I mean, in this case, it's making the lines thicker so that they show up better for the people standing at the back of the room. But I forgot to change the style for the frame labels. So the final thing that we're working on is my attempt to break GRAPHICSGRID. And by break, I mean hopefully improve it in ways that outweigh any damage that I do otherwise. And so here I have 4 random walks. So walk is just a function that is doing a list line plot of accumulative blah, 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 blah. And so in this case, what happens is, sort of everything looks not well lined up. And so we have, let's see, get that gray one. So sort of each of those, outer graphics is lined up, but within that, there's a lot of wasted space, say at the top here and whatnot. And so with the new changes to GRAPHICSGRID, we're adjusting the graphics, which GRAPHICSGRID does anyway, in ways that allow us to line up frame edges in ways so that, that's a straight, those are on the same line, those are on the same line, so on, and then horizontally as well. And at the moment, it's mainly, in this case, changes to the aspect ratio and some of the padding outside of the frame. So the padding that the labels are going in, the frame labels and frame ticks are going into. So the other part is sort of a more general approach on this, which is also going to roll out slowly starting in version 12, which is the ability for the visualization functions to create gridded output natively. So here are a slightly different set of random walks. And I've thrown them in list line plots. And by default, list line plot says you have 4 data sets. I'm going to give each of them a unique color, and they're all going to be smashed on top of each other. So what we're doing is we're going to reuse the plot layout option to the visualization functions in a way that we say, you can use more than one plot. And so in this case, we have column, and everything is on the same column. And because we know that all of these are coming from, we know information about where these graphics are coming from, we're able to make assumptions and optimize for it to some extent. And so what happens is, you'll notice that we've cut out a lot of the labels. So obviously, the top 3 plots don't have their labels going across the bottom. And if I do, a gridded output, then we get the same thing in the other direction. So we're only labeling sort of the outermost set of scales. Now I'm really wondering what's going on with that bottom left plot, because that looks like a bug. Because the other thing that we're doing is we're even adjusting what labels are, oh, I know where that's, okay. It is a bug, but not the one I thought. And it will be probably easier to see here. Is that what can happen is if we had the same labels on every axis and we duplicated them repeatedly, then what would happen is that potentially, so this minus 150 here at the bottom end of the plot range, because all of these have the same vertical plot range, it actually sticks down a little bit. And so if it was here, it would stick down a little bit and it would get really close to this 50. And we don't want them to be too close to each other. And so we don't draw it here. The plan is that we'll actually put a tick where it would be, but it won't have its label. And similarly here, and then the top one will probably get it back again. But we might need to remove the 50s. And so there's a little bit of adjustment and still figuring out what looks good and what tricks work and which ones don't entirely. So continual refinement, but yeah, so we'll be using plot layout to generate these nicely aligned graphics outputs. And at least in version 12, any options that you set for this plot are going to apply to all of them. So if I come over here and say plot style goes to red, then they're all going to be red. And if you say red, blue, purple, orange, then they're all going to be orange. Because that's what plot style does with a list if you only have one curve in the data set, which is essentially what's happening under the hood, is that it's calling list line plot of this data set with its options, this data set with its options, et cetera, et cetera. At some point in the future, we will probably have a way to address styles and options toward individual plots, but not yet. And so that concludes my talk, and we have a few minutes left if people have questions, or I'll be probably out in the hallway immediately following this talk if you have additional questions or things that you want to ask. And I'll take one last moment to plug Emmanuel and Min and Nirmal's talks at 3:30 today and 12:30 tomorrow and 2:30 tomorrow. So, yes, Jeff? Post V12. So Jeff is asking about having one plot or one frame with two or more vertical axes. And there are plans for it. A lot of the work that's going on for this, I expect to be relevant for that. There's some parts that will be completely fresh for that. And it's not for 12, but hopefully a version soon after that. Yep. Okay, thank you.